I knew something was terribly wrong the moment the wind changed an old instinct, the kind a man earns after spending a lifetime alone on the Wyoming plains. Winters out here have a way of testing a man's spirit, but the winter of 1882 felt different, colder than any I could remember. At 57, I'd weathered enough storms to know when trouble was coming. And that afternoon, the air carried a sharpness that slipped straight through my wool coat and settled deep in my bones. My place sat nearly a mile from the nearest neighbor, a small cabin built from pine logs I split myself years earlier. Most days were quiet, measured, checking the fence line, tending the cattle that remained, and walking the Caleb narrow paths along the ridge. Since Catherine passed, silence had become both my companion and my burden. Still, there was comfort in routine, in the steady rhythm of a life stripped down to its essentials. But as the daylight thinned and the snow under my boots lay smooth and untouched, I felt a pull, something urging me to look closer, to step beyond the familiar. And what I saw next would change the course of that night and my life in ways I never expected. I followed the trail only a few yards before I saw its small footprints, no longer than 8 inches, weaving unsteadily across the snow. At first, I thought they belonged to a child, but then I noticed the deeper impressions, the way the weight dragged as if each step had taken more strength than the last. A few drops of blood dotted the path, dark against the white crust. I felt my stomach tighten. Out here, in weather like this, anyone traveling barefoot wouldn't last more than an hour. I knelt beside the prints, the cold biting through my gloves, and let my hand hover just above the snow. The wind had not yet filled them in, which meant whoever left them couldn't be more than half a mile ahead. Something inside me, something I thought had died with Catherine, stirred. I couldn't explain it then, but I knew I had no choice except to follow. The trail led me deeper into the pines, where the snow lay heavier and the world grew still, as if holding its breath. And then, near the base of a tall lodgepole pine, I saw a shape curled against the trunk, small, motionless, and half buried by drifting snow. What happened next is something I will never forget. When I reached her, I truly believed I was too late. She was curled tight against the base of that pine, barefoot, her legs half buried under nearly 6 inches of drifted snow. Her skin had turned the gray-blue color I'd seen more than once in men who didn't make it back from winter storms. But then I caught the faintest rise of her chest, the kind of shallow breath that could vanish at any second. I knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her face, and found a young woman no more than 23 or 24, with long black hair frozen into stiff strands. Her clothing was torn, decorated with beadwork I recognized as Apache craftsmanship. Whoever she was, she had been through hell long before the storm reached her. When I slipped my arms beneath her to lift her from the snow, she tensed, a frightened instinct, but she was far too weak to resist. Her body weighed little more than a winter coat, and I could feel the tremor of cold shaking through her as I held her against my chest. I had walked that trail hundreds of times, but never had the distance back to my cabin felt so long. The wind pushed against us, and more than once I had to lean into it, bracing my boots so she wouldn't slip from my arms. Halfway home, she stirred, her lips barely moving. "One night," she whispered in broken English. "Just one night." I didn't know what she meant then, but the way she said it, half plea, half surrender, stayed with me. By the time my cabin came into view, smoke drifting softly from the chimney, I knew that carrying her inside would change far more than just the course of that evening. And I was right, because what awaited us behind that door would lead to a truth I never expected to face. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit us like a wall, and for a moment I felt the young woman sink against me, as if her body finally understood it was safe. Caleb, my 16-year-old nephew, was sitting at the table cleaning a colt he had no permission to touch. His eyes widened the instant he saw who I carried in my arms. "You brought an Apache into our house?" he snapped, standing so fast his chair scraped across the floor. I didn't answer. I laid her gently on the long bench near the stove, close enough for the heat to reach her, but far enough that the sudden warmth wouldn't shock her frozen limbs. Her shivering had turned violent, now a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting. I told Caleb to fetch blankets, and though his jaw clenched with teenage stubbornness, he went. I worked quickly, thawing her hands and feet with warm water, checking her ribs, cleaning the rope burns around her wrists with whiskey. The girl barely made a sound, but every flinch told a story I wasn't ready to hear. When Caleb returned, He hovered in the corner, torn between fear and curiosity. "Why'd you bring her here?" he asked, his voice not as sharp as before. I didn't look up, because leaving her in the snow wasn't something I could live with. It was the only answer I had, and the only one that mattered. She drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring words I couldn't understand, clutching a small leather pouch against her chest as if it held her last thread of hope. And though neither of us knew it yet, that pouch and the men hunting it would soon turn our quiet, isolated life into something far more dangerous than any storm outside. By dawn, the cabin had settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that rests just long enough for a man to realize how close danger truly is. My shoulder throbbed from the strain of the night before lifting her, carrying her, but it was nothing compared to what I felt when I stepped outside and heard the distant creak of saddle leather. I froze. After 57 winters in Wyoming, I knew the sound of horses moving with intention. Whoever was out there wasn't passing through. They were searching. Caleb came to the door behind me, the Winchester in his hands, his eyes wide and alert. I motioned for him to stay back. The snow was falling lightly now, soft flakes drifting across the yard. But through the curtain of white I saw them 3, maybe 4 shadows weaving between the pines about a mile out. Men on horseback, moving slow, watching. Inside, the girl stirred again, waking with a gasp as if pulled from some nightmare. She tried to rise but winced, her bruised ribs stopping her. I knelt beside her. "Who's hunting you?" I asked. Her dark eyes met mine, full of fear and something else, resignation. She reached for the leather pouch she had kept close from the moment I found her and whispered a name that chilled me more than the wind ever could. Carter Briggs. I hadn't heard that name spoken in nearly a decade. Not since the man I once called a friend disappeared after a string of troubling rumors. The idea that he could be behind her suffering and now riding toward my land brought a heaviness to my chest I couldn't shake. And as the shadows in the tree line grew closer, I knew the quiet life I'd built was about to be tested in ways I hadn't faced since my younger days. The hours that followed felt longer than any winter night I could remember. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, muffling every sound except the crackle of the stove and the faint, steady breathing of the girl resting on the bench. I kept my Colt close, watching the window for any sign of movement. Caleb paced near the stairs, restless but trying hard to hide the fear only a 16-year-old boy would think he could conceal. I couldn't blame him. Truth was, my own hands weren't as steady as they used to be. Just after midday, the stillness broke. A single rider emerged from the tree line, moving slowly, almost peacefully, until he stopped about 50 yards out. The man raised an empty hand, calling out that he wished to speak. But before I could answer, another figure stepped from the woods behind him, an older Apache warrior with braided gray hair and a steady gaze. He introduced himself as Kuruk and said he had been searching for the young woman I'd carried home. There was something reassuring about him, a quiet strength that settled the air around us. Still, his next words tightened the knot in my chest. He warned that more men were coming, men far more dangerous than the ones keeping their distance in the trees, and if we wished to survive the night, we would need to stand together. That night came down heavy and cold, the kind of darkness that seems to settle into a man's bones. We had barely finished reinforcing the shutters when the first gunshot split the air sharp, close, and followed by the unmistakable thunder of horses charging. The cabin shuddered under the impact as bullets tore into the outer walls. Caleb fired from the upstairs window, his Winchester kicking hard against his shoulder, while Kuruk moved like a shadow between the porch and the tree line, returning fire with calm, practiced aim. I stayed near the girl Kiana, my Colt ready, though my left arm throbbed from the strain of the day. The cabin filled with smoke from the stove and the gunpowder, turning every breath into a reminder of how fragile the moment was. The attackers pressed harder, close enough now that I could hear them shouting orders. One of them smashed through the south shutter, forcing his way inside. Kiana moved before I could, quick, steady, driving her knife forward with a courage earned from too many years of suffering. When the man fell, silence rushed in again, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant retreat of hooves. But Kuruk's grim expression told me what my gut already knew. This was only the beginning, and the next wave would be far deadlier. When the smoke finally cleared and the last of McKenna's men were taken away, the cabin fell into a stillness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the uneasy quiet of loneliness, it was the kind that settles after a storm has passed, when a man can finally breathe again. My left shoulder healed slowly, inch by inch. the way injuries do when you're past 50. But Kiana stayed through every long night, changing bandages, tending the fire, and sitting beside me when the pain grew sharper than I cared to admit. Caleb grew, 2 shoulders broader, eyes steadier as if the winter had carved a bit of manhood into him. As spring pushed through the last patches of snow, life around the ranch began to feel different. The land looked the Calebe, nearly 160 acres of open Wyoming sky, but something in me had shifted. For the first time since Catherine passed, the house no longer felt like a place I was waiting to leave. It felt like a place someone might come home to. One morning, with the sun warming the porch boards beneath my boots, I asked Kiana to stay not as a guest, but as family. And when she smiled and said yes, I realized the truth. Sometimes the harshest winters bring the gentlest blessings. What stays with me most from that winter is not the violence nor the hardship, but the reminder that even in the last chapters of a person's life, something unexpected can still take root and grow. We often believe our seasons of purpose end as the years gather behind us, but the truth is simpler and far gentler. As long as we draw breath, we can still be called to protect, to forgive, and to love. Matthew Calder's choice to help a stranger, even when he felt he had little left to give, shows how compassion can reopen doors we thought were closed forever. His willingness to forgive an old friend who lost his way reminds us that mercy, not bitterness, is what frees the heart. And his late-in-life marriage to Kiana teaches that companionship can return when we least expect it, offering warmth in years we once feared would be cold. For older adults, the story is a quiet encouragement. Your experiences, your courage, and your kindness still matter. You are never finished growing. You are never too old to make a difference. And sometimes, just by showing up with a steady hand and an open heart, you become the blessing someone else has been waiting for.